We begin with a Fox News alert. 162 people, including 17 children, are still missing after hours of searching for AirAsia Flight 8501. Ships are frantically searching for the plane through the night, but due to bad weather, air searches have been postponed until morning. David Piper is in Thailand. David, what's next in this search?
Hi, Doug. As you said, the air search has been suspended for the past few hours because of that bad weather. But yes, if the weather does improve at first light, they will be sending the planes out again. But some boats have been out on the sea, the Java Sea, all night so far. The region has been pummeled by heavy rains in recent days, causing severe flooding in nearby Malaysia. AirAsia CEO Tony Fernandez has been giving a news conference in Surabaya, Indonesia. He said the pilot did radio in that they were facing severe weather. Fernandez didn't have, though, any news on the whereabouts of the plane, and he says his priority at the moment is to the loved ones of those on board.
And we hope that the aircraft is found quickly and we can find out the cause of what has happened. But for the moment, we don't want to speculate. We do not know what's happened, and our prime concern now is to look after the family.
Indonesia air traffic control lost contact with the plane over 12 hours ago now. The AirAsia flight was on its way from Surabaya in Indonesia to Singapore. It had 162 passengers and crew on board. The vast majority of those on the plane were Indonesian. The Airbus was about an hour into its 3-hour journey to Singapore when it disappeared from radar screens. Indonesian search and rescue planes had been looking in an area of the Java Sea near Belitung Island before the air search was suspended. AirAsia said earlier flight QZ8501 had requested what it described as a deviation from the flight path due to bad weather. And Indonesia's Transport Ministry said the pilot had asked permission to climb to 38,000 feet to avoid thick cloud. The crew didn't issue a distress call. Meanwhile, anxious friends and relatives went to both Surabaya and Singapore airports for news on the plane. The budget airline, which has its headquarters in Malaysia, has never lost a plane before, but the national carrier Malaysia Airlines has lost 2 this year, MH370, which just disappeared, and MH17 over Ukraine. Of course, it's still dark here, but as I said, at first light, hopefully those planes will be able to go back into the skies and search for the missing aircraft. Back to you, Doug.
David Piper in Thailand. Thank you, David. Just before AirAsia Flight 8501 lost communication, officials say one of the pilots asked for permission to go to a higher altitude because of the bad weather. Joining me now is former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Transportation Oliver McGee. Oliver, thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Doug.
Weather, obviously a big concern. It was a big concern for the pilots. They wanted to go to a higher altitude to evade this bad weather. What is the potential for this kind of bad weather causing real damage to an airplane?
Well, this is MH370 Air France 447 deja vu. Oftentimes when you have very tough storms like this, you get black cells at high altitudes. And
black cells?
Black cells.
And what is a black cell?
Essentially, this is when the aircraft flies into a zone of high turbulence winds and storms, and that causes distortion of the airflow into the intake of the engine. And the engine can literally choke, stall. And essentially you may have all kinds of icicles or hailstorms that may be ingested inside the engine. And so therefore the engine flames out and literally falls out of the sky.
Now, can hail also damage an engine?
Yes, it goes into engines like bullets.
I see.
And it causes foreign object damage and high cycle fatigue.
And all this kind of damage is largely dependent on the size of the hail, correct?
Yes, yes. And typically in these particular tough, rough storms, you get very, very large object hail objects that can get ingested inside the engine.
And there's also another factor in weather like this, and the icing conditions, which has been known to cause air mishaps in the past with large jetliners, and I'm thinking particularly of that Air France Flight 447, which crashed in the South Atlantic. It took a long time for investigators to finally piece together the causes of that crash, but it was a fascinating case.
Yes, it's a fascinating case because since 1948, Doug, we have had trouble finding aircraft inside oceans. And this really calls for a global tracking of aircraft, like that is being asked by the International Air Transport Association. But it also calls for putting the black box in the cloud. Once again, Doug, we're looking for another black box to find out the true story behind this aircraft. And when we lose these black boxes in remote regions of the oceans, it takes a very, very long time to find out the mystery and find out what's solving the problem. Because if we don't get the black box, we don't know what happened to the engine performance.
Well, in that case, that Flight 447, they did find the black box ultimately, I believe, correct?
After 2 years.
After 2 years.
Yes.
And so that's why it kind of fell off the radar screen,
Yes.
bad use of language there, in terms of popular awareness of this story. But it was the pitot tubes, the thing which measure airspeed, which got clogged with ice crystals. They ultimately found out, correct?
Yes. Oftentimes when a pilot is trying to get out of a storm, they're really trying to save the aircraft. And so they're really doing all kinds of things, heroic measures, to try to save an aircraft that's potentially unstable. And when you're in a storm and the engine is basically literally choking, like you're choking yourself, you're trying to get power back. The aircraft engine's trying to breathe and try to get the aircraft back into stable zone. So typically, there are all kinds of things that the pilot's trying to do to save the aircraft.
In that case, correct me if I'm wrong, he was applying, he thought he had a certain airspeed, and so he climbed to get out of the storm when in fact, because the pitot tubes were not giving him the correct warnings, the correct readings, he was actually sinking in a very controlled stall, unaware of it.
That's right.
All the way down into the ocean from 20, 30,000 feet high.
That's right. You're an aircraft engine expert, Doug. That's exactly right. Stall will cause you to lose engine performance. And in tough storms like this, and where there are black cells, there's varying temperature distributions. And power in aircraft engines is all about the temperature distribution.
Is there any consideration in your mind that some other factor may have played a role in this missing AirAsia flight?
My early take on the story today is that's the primary cause of some type of inlet distortion that caused the aircraft engine to choke, literally choke and stall. And then essentially what would happen is the airplane would tend to spiral out of the sky.
I suppose the good news, if there is any at this point, is that it crashed in an area which is marked by very, very shallow water. I think the Java Sea is only 200 feet deep on average.
Yes.
So the prospects of finding the black box and or maybe even potentially survivors is high, I would think.
True and not true. Finding black boxes inside oceanic waters is like finding a needle in a haystack. So we must be patient and do diligent in that. But we do need to get that black box. But once again, this calls for global tracking of aircraft, and also it's time to put the black box in the cloud. So because right now, we wouldn't be talking about finding a black box right now. We'd have the data already if it was in the cloud.
And we say all this as a matter of speculation. Let's make that absolutely clear. For all we know, the plane may not have crashed at this point.
That's true.
We will find out in the hours and days to come, hopefully. Oliver McGee, thank you very much. Good to see you.
Thank you, Doug.